Hi, and welcome to exercise application video number 23, I believe, from a very rainy Tuesday. But today I want to talk about general adaptations to endurance training, which if you've watched any of these videos, you're like, what? She never does endurance training. We're working on it. But I've recently begun a new program that incorporates a lot of HIIT and like circuit training, which sure, it's not going to give you the adaptations that running a mile every day would, but it's still endurance training, especially for someone like myself who is not very well trained cardiovascularly. I expect to see lots of improvements actually in this field. So when we think about endurance training, our overall goal is going to be increasing our VO2 max, right? Which is the rate at which we can consume and utilize oxygen. So when we're talking about consumption, we're talking more about respiration. So inhaling, exhaling, or not so much exhaling, but inhalation. And there's not really a ton that we can do for that because the surface area of our lungs is already so great. In very, very rare instances with like Sherpas, we can see some adaptations to that. But I certainly am not a Sherpa in Dahlonega, Georgia. Maybe you are, but I'm not, so I don't have that adaptation. So what we have to work on is, well, with the VO2 formula, we see Q minus the arterial venous difference, essentially, which is what we are intaking and then what we are using. So ultimately, we want to increase our VO2 max, so we're working on doing things that can increase our Q. So, so we're not only increasing our Q, we're becoming more efficient in how we're using our oxygen. So our general adaptations when we think about endurance training are, number one, we get more mitochondria. Because endurance training is done aerobically in the presence of oxygen, we're in the mitochondria. So our Krebs, our ETC, which are ETC, we get the most bang for our buck. It's in the mitochondria. So the more mitochondria we have, the more we can use those pathways. And then the less we fatigue because we're not as dependent upon our things like glycolysis. Which glycolysis, we fatigue very quickly, we run out of substrate, or even the ATP PCR. And that's also where we get that buildup of lactate and thus quicker fatigue. So by becoming more dependent on our aerobic pathways, by having more mitochondria, we fatigue less easily and we can go for longer periods of time and use more oxygen. Secondly, we want to increase our capillary density because we can have all the mitochondria in the world, but if our capillaries don't increase, we're not able to get more oxygen in past a certain point. So as we increase the density of our capillaries, we're bringing more oxygen in, which we then can take into our mitochondria, use for our bioenergetics. And then thirdly, our third kind of general adaptations we see with endurance training is increased oxidation of fat, which is, I kind of hit on this just now. As we become more dependent on our aerobic pathways, right? Aerobic activity is more fueled by fats than carbs. When we think of what's using carbs, we think really high intensity, really short bursts, maybe sprinting whatever, 100, swimming a 100, a 50. Really quick activities, we're really carb dependent. But as we do those longer term endurance activities, we're using more fat, which is thus going to push our lactate threshold, allowing us to go further, and allow us, we're just less susceptible to fatigue. And the reason we get that increase of oxidation of fat is A, we have increased capillary density, so we can bring more to then the mitochondria, which in the mitochondria we can use those fat. Because what we create is actually a steeper oxygen gradient because we're using more and more, so we have a higher demand and things like to go from high to low, so then we're using more and more oxygen and thus more and more fats because that's a lot of our substrate when we're talking about aerobic driven activities. So as I'm doing those exercises, I'm working on all of those things. A lot of these are via some genetic transcription factors, various things, which I'll talk about in a later video, but these are the overall adaptations.